I'm sure you've heard it said that money is the root of all evil, right? That's a misquote. Did you know that? The actual quote is, the love of money is the root of all evil. Because, see, you can do a lot of good things with money. Hey, if you don't want yours, go out and find a needy cause and donate it. But it's that love of money that sparks that growth of the tiny little seed that is in all human beings called greed. And if it gets out of control, bad things can happen. Terrible things can happen. You can make life miserable for those around you. And I'm going to tell you a story right now that's a good case in point. It's about a woman, really, and her husband who was a greedy, miserly bastard. There's no other way to put it. He was friendly. He was kind. But the most important thing to him in his life was his money. And he would not part with it. It stemmed from the fact that he grew up in the Depression era. He's gone now. He was part of the World War II generation. He knew what it was like to do without. He spent his entire childhood doing without, his young adulthood. He finally became successful in his later years, but it was that deeply rooted fear of not having enough that caused him to be such a stingy, miserly, Ebenezer Scrooge. So I met him and his wife 25 years ago. My first 8 years out of college, I was a financial planner. So I used to work with people and their money. And let me tell you, the things I've seen, you probably heard it said too, that money can drive some people crazy. I've seen that as well. But the particular situation I'm talking about here was really heartbreaking because this man, and he was worth millions. His net worth, I can tell you, I'm not going to mention his name, but I can tell you his net worth was roughly $5 million. It's a true rags to riches story. But if you didn't know this about him, his affluence, you would never guess it. He lived in a tiny little brick ranch house, like so many folks from his generation. He drove a nice car. It was 20 years old, but it was clean, as if he had just driven it off the lot. It was paid for. But the thing that was heart-wrenching about this situation was that he let his wife not go without, per se. Her needs were met, and they raised 4 children, and she stayed at home to take care of those kids and take care of the house while he ran his businesses. He actually made the bulk of his money, the lion's share of it, in real estate investments. But she had everything she needed, but she never really had anything she wanted. And I thought it was just really terrible. She wasn't extravagant. She didn't want expensive purses. What she really wanted to do was to go places. She wanted to have experiences. They were from here in rural Virginia. He left, of course, to go off to fight the Germans in the war, fight his way across Europe. He came back. She never really went anywhere else. I mean, maybe some surrounding states, maybe down to Myrtle Beach, but she always wanted to travel abroad, she told me. And she said it didn't matter if it was the south of France. She'd settle for the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Bahamas. As you know, you can go there without even having to have a passport. But her husband would never take her to any of these places because he didn't want to get up off any of that money and spend it to take these trips. It was truly heartbreaking. And she loved him. She didn't necessarily begrudge him for it, but she begrudged the attitude. So I met them in their later years. I was their financial advisor. And the time came when the man passed away. And I had met with him about 3 or 4 times a year for 4 or 5 years before he died. And he would always say that when he died, it was in his will that his money would be buried with him. He was going to take it with him. Not only did he not spend much of it during his lifetime, not only did he not take his wife on any overseas trips, he said he wanted to be buried with his money. And every time he'd say it, I would laugh, and he would look at me as if he was insulted, and his wife would give me this very stern look that said, he's not kidding. So I went to the funeral, and she actually asked me to sit beside her. She had a couple of her children were there. Well, they were all there. She sat with a couple you could tell they were kind of estranged. So I was sitting beside her, and before they closed the casket after the viewing, this is actually the wake the night before, she had a shoebox with her, and she walked it up to the casket and put it in just as they were closing it, and she came back and sat down beside me, and I looked over at her, and I said, oh my gosh, did you literally just put all of his money in there with him so he could be buried with his money? And she said, it was his dying wish. She said it just before he passed in the hospital. She said, so yeah. She goes, once he died, I had everything transferred into my name. And then I wrote him a check, and I just stuck it in his casket. Now, did he ever cash the check? I don't think he did, because about 3 months later, I got a postcard from her from Jamaica. And about a year after that, I got a postcard from her from the south of France. Never heard from her again after that, because shortly after that, I quit that business and went in the military myself and was over in the Middle East. But I'd like to think she's still out there somewhere, south of France. Maybe she's crossed her way across Europe, touring it. Maybe she's back down in the Bahamas. Maybe she's traveling through Asia. I'd like to think these things. But I guarantee you, he has not cashed that check.